our April 14th Village of Franklin special meeting workshop. We're not doing roll or agenda. So the purpose of this initially was to be a budget workshop, which we will do partially, although I'm not sure we have 2 hours worth of budget work. So after the budget work, we can pick up on some of our prioritizing and some other items that have come down the pipe in the last week or so. So Mag, why don't you start with what you want to accomplish
So today,
budgeting?
briefly, I'll go over some of the questions that were asked at our last budget session, but most of them came out during our last council meeting a couple weeks ago that pertain to the budget. So I'll provide some additional information there. And then what would be the most effective thing to come out of this meeting, and the goal is for council to help identify what our goals are gonna be in the next budget. It's essential to narrow down what strategically we wanna be spending on in our next budget before I can even give a draft budget, because I need to have an idea of what projects we're gonna have moving forward. So we talked about some projects that have been funded or spoken about in the past at our first strategic planning meeting. Today is the opportunity for council members to give their feedback on that, tell us which projects you support. If you're supporting projects that were not discussed in the original strategic planning, that's okay, but let's discuss them now, because today when we end this session, I wanna have a good idea of where we're going to be prioritizing budgeting funds moving forward. After I get the priorities done, after today's council meeting and then the following closed session, we will go ahead and get you a draft budget to start looking at. If we need more time, we have a month buffer, and we can always push back approving the budget into June, but otherwise we should be ready to go for May. So during our last council meeting, when we were discussing some of the budget questions, a few questions arose. One was regarding building department fees. If you look at our current budget, you can see that there's a balance in the building department of about almost $700,000. And the question was, why is that there? How does that work? How do we use those funds? So those funds are regulated through the state, and they are earmarked to only support the building department. The exact language is the legislative body of a government shall only use fees generated under this section, which is the revenue source that's going into this little pool of money, for the operation of the enforcing agency, which is our building department, construction board of appeals, or both. So those funds everywhere have always been restricted. What's different and interesting this year is, as I went through our budget, there are a number of general fund items that can be earmarked and put over out of the building department to be paid for, operationally speaking. So last year was one of the first years that we had moved a portion of certain staff salaries where that staff spends time supporting the building department over into the building budget, which was good. That was positive to see. Things that we were missing that should be allocated over to the budget department that were not previously, I did a full audit of everything looking at that. And the purpose was, is there anything that we can put over in the building department that's approved expenses over there that would alleviate some of the funds that are coming out of the general fund? And the answer to that is yes. I found over $41,000 of expenses that we've been paying out of our general fund that actually can be allocated over into the building department. And I'll circulate a spreadsheet of those, but most of them are just around the operations of the building department. For example, we can pay a portion of our utilities to support the building department, of our phones, of our internet, of our IT uses, all go for the building department. There's a portion of our communication expenses that go to the building department. There's definitely a portion of our accounting services that go to the building department. There's a lot of accounting that happens specifically for the building department and keeps track of that. And then in addition, there's a portion of my salary that can be allocated to the building department. On average, I spend about 8 hours a week doing and managing the building department functions. Some of that is because Bill, our building official, only works part-time, so when he's not here, I would be the next one kind of in line to troubleshoot and answer questions. Other parts of that come from me interacting directly with contractors as they're coming through, answering questions, keeping them on pace there, or even down to, me answering the phone for the building department, scheduling inspections. Because we're short-staffed, the portion of my time is definitely supported over there. So that was a positive that we found from that question. Like I said, I have a spreadsheet I'll circulate, but approximately about $41,000 this year you can expect to see come out of our alleviated stress from the general fund and thus build back to this building department fund, which has plenty of funds to support that. Another question that we really had was a lot about engineering invoices, engineering totals that we had paid for on projects, and sort of where we were at with that. I went back to 2020 and did a full accounting of all the engineering invoices that had been paid out, what projects that they were allocated to, where we were at with those projects. And again, that's in a spreadsheet that I will share. But the cliff notes in that is that since 2021, the village has invested over $30,000 in engineering services for walkways and pathways, and at least half of those were earmarked specifically for this Apple Tree and Irving path. So we've spent a lot of money on this path. It's close to the finish line. It's one of the things we talked about when we looked at strategic planning. But I do think that's something important to frame and keep in mind, is we've spent a lot of money on engineering. There really shouldn't be more engineering costs associated with that project, or if there were, they would be limited. But that, I think, is important when you're considering your priorities. What have we already invested in, and what should we just move over the finish line? In addition, thus far, we've spent about $17,000 to $20,000 on engineering for the sidewalk on 13 Miles. So that would be another item that we have talked about, that we've spent a lot of engineering on, that we need to kind of decide where we're going to take that next. Another question we were asked last time was to clarify, what services the Southfield Township provides for us versus Oakland County versus our clerk, and how those are broken down. So I have a good record here of that, and that's all attached in the spreadsheet that I will pass out. But for the most part, we still administer and collect some of the taxes over here, all the summer taxes. Of course, the township takes care of our elections, assessing services between the township and the county, our animal control. Oakland County takes care of our marriage, birth, and death certificates. Bloomfield Township Clerk is where you would go to get any passport applications over there. And our clerk is responsible for publishing all the records of the ordinances, providing certified copies of village records, issuing oaths of affirmations, filing signed contracts, processing all insurance and renewals. They play a role in some of the finance, just as far as checks and balances and reviewing the allocation of funds that are going out. They're the secretary and the record keeper for the village, preparing all the agendas and the minutes for the village, and takes care of that record there. Lastly, we had a question about garbage and rubbish. Switching our contract from GFL over to Priority had our garbage contract increase significantly. And part of that is because the contract we previously had with GFL had us locked in at a low rate. So even if we had renewed with GFL, we would have been expected to pay more, and then switching over to Priority increase. For example, our previous trash contract had the trash pickup services at about $15,000. Our new one is $27,000 a month. So definitely increase. The reason that was brought up, and something that we should look at, is because we collect a separate millage by charter for garbage and rubbish. And we wanted to ensure that the rate of which we are collecting that is sufficient to cover these costs. In the calculations that I have, the last time that had been adjusted, it is sufficient to cover even the increases that we have right now with garbage and rubbish. However, I want to look more at that language and at that funding, and look and see if there are other portions of yard waste pickup that we're paying for out of the general fund that could actually be considered garbage and rubbish. Under our ordinance, yard waste does fall as a definition of rubbish. And so there would be a portion of these contracts that we have with Jerry Johnson and some of our tree services, which will require a deeper dive from me, but I believe that portion of those expenses could possibly
Well,
be
when he
allocated
cleans up
there.
after a storm and stuff,
Yep. It,
that seems more like garbage that has been generated more so than his regular tree maintenance or
Agreed.
landscaping services.
Agreed. Landscaping services, not rubbish. Yard waste, tree pickup after a storm, rubbish. It falls under this definition of rubbish. So that will require me to look deeper into that, and I didn't have time to prepare all of those numbers. Bottom line, our trash and rubbish rate is sufficient to cover our expenses with the new priority contract as it stands right now. However, if we're looking at it deeper to see what is all encompassed by this spending, we might need to adjust that. So that one is a little TBD, we'll report back. So I'll distribute the numbers that I have here in regards to those few topics, and we can continue to look at that as we're moving forward. But that's some of the budget work that we've been doing since we've last met to discuss these items. I think to help frame this conversation, I'd like to run through a couple of larger line items that we would have had in our budget last year that are not necessary for our budget this year. And that'll give you an idea of some of this, the pool of this spending that we have available to dedicate to whatever projects we decide are the priorities. We had allocated in our previous budget $10,000 for engineering on Appleway and Irving Path, and another $25,000 for just the construction of trails and pathways for a total of $35,000. If this path becomes a priority this year, again, to move through, the cost I had broken down for you in your strategic planning budget, but of one of the options was about $60,000. So from what I can see right now is in relation to our budget last year, we budgeted $35,000, and we didn't dip into that. That's still sitting here. So if we want to finish up that path, it's going to cost a total of $60,000. So we need another $25,000 that might need to be budgeted. These are just to help frame this conversation.
Can you put these up there? Can Dana put them up there?
No, but I can print you a copy of
Okay.
my notes. We budgeted last year $15,000 for Broughton House improvements, and they did some restoration of the building. That was completed successfully, so it would be a project that we wouldn't need to fund again this year, and again, that's another $15,000. We had a capital outlay line item in your budget from last year, and you'll see it had $150,000 in it, and it had a few projects that were suggested under there. But this year we had to use that money to replace furnaces, to replace generators, so it went to capital projects appropriately. But we need to decide how we want to hold space for that moving forward. And so some of the 150 was made up of these projects. 25,000 for the pathways, which we discussed, 30,000 for an electric charging station, 40,000 for an electric sign. So we need to kind of determine what those capital priorities are gonna be today, and then we can fund the budget around that. In the budget, you had $4,000 for the administrator's office and equipment, but I came in and used all the same furniture and equipment that Roger had, with exception of I need a new laptop. So that was an additional $4,000 over there that would be available for you this year. You had $80,000 earmarked in your major street funds. Now, this isn't general fund, but you had it broken down as follows. $50,000 for your 13 miles sidewalk, and $30,000 for sidewalks south of 13 Mile on Franklin
Is
Road.
that part of the 80K or in addition to?
Oh, that's how the 80K was broken
Okay.
down, was the 50 and the 30.
Okay, sorry. I just
Nope,
wanna make sure.
that's a good question. You had an additional $10,000 budgeted for engineering related to stormwater services, and we were in the process of a stormwater study, which we'll get into the details of after the budget is passed, but that's what that was sitting there for, and that study is concluded. Now, you know, there's always projects that come up in stormwater in the village, and it is wise for us to budget for some engineering costs, just anticipating that will arise throughout the year, but $10,000, I'm not sure. In addition, you had budgeted $40,000 for a part-time position in the office that didn't get filled. So that is still sort of sitting over there. Now, a portion of those funds were used to pay for the social media contract we have, but the rest of, which is comes out to $12,000, but the rest of that is just still sitting there.
What was the duties of the part-time?
It wasn't clear.
Okay.
I went back, I think that if we could pause, that's an important segue. I went back through 2023 and watched every study session, every budget meeting, every discussion that I could find. Now, I did notice that there is one study session that happened on May 16th of last year, where a lot of these issues were talked about, that because it was a workshop, there's no minutes, and the video's not available. So I don't have any firsthand information about what would have happened in that specific meeting. But tonight, we're gonna go into our regularly scheduled meeting, and then we're gonna call a closed session to discuss a few items. One of those items will be a discussion around salaries and around positions. So I would hold your questions
Yeah.
until we're there.
Okay.
I mean, I can answer them
Yeah,
for
of
you,
course.
but know that we're gonna
Yeah.
have time, and I've prepared a memo with all the important information I can find, so we can kind of pick through that
Okay.
there. But I just, as we're having the budget conversation, wanna bring that up. Additionally, we had budgeted for $10,000 for a public relations consultant, and that was in regard to you going for a Headley override millage. Now, we may need a consultant in the future when we look at possible other millages, but that wouldn't be something that I would suggest budgeting for this year. As soon as I get through this, I'll make this
Spend
copy.
that on Karen Cohen, because she helped us with the,
She did, and so did Andrea. Prior
Okay.
to her having a contract as a social media consultant, she was
Okay.
brought in and helped a little bit with the Headley override and worked on the Pickering Barn. I'm not sure.
Okay.
We might be able to pull it up and look,
I
but
just wondered if you were classifying it as unspent funds, or if you think it was spent. I don't know the answer.
it would be, I couldn't speak for certain, but it's my understanding that it was spent. It would just be a line item this year that I
Yeah.
don't need
Got it.
necessarily. So when we're talking about projects, how much money do we even have for projects, some of these will help. And then
Sorry, the
Yep.
Headley override, what year was that?
2020, do you guys?
It was an election year, so it would have been 2022.
Yeah,
It was the
so
same
this
election
wouldn't
cycle
have
I
been
was
for
on.
the Headley override.
Yes.
This was last year's budget.
I'm guessing that it probably just got left in the
Yeah, I'm
budget and
thinking it
didn't
did,
get
yeah.
removed out of the
I think
budget.
there was discussion about potentially asking for a charter amendment.
I don't remember that we did any work on a charter amendment, but there was significant work done on Headley, because I remember Karen that Roger and Karen couldn't get it together.
That was
Get it
for
over the-
2022.
yep.
That was for two, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And that would have
So
been
then
for
this just
two,
would
so
have been
this,
carried over.
yeah, it looks
Alright.
like an expense that's been carried
Yeah,
over.
okay.
And then we had a smaller line item, just over $2,000 to replace street signs and poles. So that would be another thing. Yes.
Is that the final one? So I know there was 20K allotted to the bicentennial.
I don't see that. I don't know what line item it would have been. I don't see that in here. Do you guys know?
What did they pay for all the signs and all the bicentennial stuff out of?
The only charge that I saw in relation, or the only notes that I see in relation to that on your budget was for the cost of hanging the banners for the bicentennial.
So maybe it came out of like office supplies?
No, I think
Historical Society pay for it?
No, we had initially, so I don't know the amount, but I do remember that we set aside funds for the bicentennial
Yeah.
that because all of the groups were coming together, and so what we were saying is that we would commit some of the resources to it. But the signs that you're seeing out there were part of a grant that was put together, and we were awarded that grant. And then I had asked a question for a follow-up on whether or not we've like where we were at with expending the resources towards it. I don't think the village ended up committing funds to.
I don't see that in the budget,
that,
so
but-
that would track.
Yeah,
me,
so
but
like
I
your
don't
question
know.
about like the Franklin Historical or the Franklin Baseball League like canvases that are on the light post, for instance, that say like